Hello, welcome to the office hours. This is, I'm streaming this on Thursday, November 6th, 2025, and I have got a couple of questions already that people have emailed in. So I will answer the questions that are emailed to me as I usually do, but if you have a question, I'm happy to take your question. I can see the questions whether you post them on Facebook or on YouTube. I can see them. So welcome to the live stream. So the first question that I got, it's actually the second question I got, but I'm going to answer it first. And it was a differentiation question. And what's interesting is I got a differentiation question last time too, which led to the whole thing, right? And in this case, the person wrote and said that they were an instructional specialist and that they wanted to know, so they're working with multiple teachers, right? So they're an instructional specialist, and this is what they wrote. This person wrote, "My teachers are struggling with how to balance all of the accommodations within a lesson plan. They are not looking or have time to make a completely separate lesson plan for a gifted student. Any suggestions for how to embed gifted learning into a lesson plan?" So I think this was a genuinely asked question, meaning I don't think the person is I don't think necessarily there's some underlying anti-gifted sentiment in here. It's hard to read, isn't it? It's hard to hear. Why should the gifted get the scraps off of the table? Why is it that they're having to do the accommodations for other people, and they will because they're forced to by federal law, but not willing to serve the gifted, even though their needs are just as great? And so that part's hard, right? It's hard to hear for those of us who care about the gifted, for those of us working as gifted advocates, for those of us who are gifted ourselves and have been through lowercase t traumatic school experiences because those needs were ignored. It's really hard to hear. But I do have some answers, and I hope I could share. So let me say the question again. I'm an instructional specialist. My teachers are struggling with how to balance all the accommodations within a lesson plan. They are not looking or have time to make a completely separate lesson plan for a gifted student. Any ideas for how to embed gifted learning into a lesson plan? So I wrote back my number one suggestion, which I always say, and if you've taken my differentiation course, you know that this is what I'm going to say, which is that we have to plan with our highest level learner in mind. The biggest mistake that a teacher can make is to plan for, let me say this. The biggest mistake a teacher can make, if what their goal is to meet the needs of gifted kids or to meet the needs of all the learners in the class, is to start planning with the on-level learner in mind, and then make the adjustments you're required to make by federal law for those with learning disabilities. And then if you have time, if it's not already 2 a.m. or whatever, then think of something else that your high ability kids could do. So this is not the correct order of events. This is not how it should go. And when teachers try to do this, 100% of the time, they will end up in trouble. They will end up never having that time because lesson planning is like a gas. It just expands to fill the space. However much time you give it, it will take. So my number one suggestion that I always give is it starts with where you begin your planning. You must begin with what your best kids could do. What could my best kids do here? And even if that's only 2 kids in the class, what could those kids do? And when you say, okay, my best kids could do this, and then you think to yourself, what would I have to alter or adjust in this plan for my on-level kids to do, my typical learners, the bulk of my class, most of the kids? What would I have to adjust? And it may be as simple as, they could do it if they had a word bank. or they could do it if I just took out one of these questions, or they could do it if I let them work with a friend, right? This is just basics of tiered instruction. So then you say, what do I need to do so that my students who need more scaffolding, who need more support, could approach this lesson? And then of course you have particular accommodations that students might have, which are, maybe they have an accommodation for extended time or oral administration of tests or any of the myriad accommodations that can come. So the short answer is they have to plan with the highest level learner in mind when they begin the planning. If you don't do that, you'll always be behind. And one of the difficulties comes in that a lot of teachers are using curriculum that is scripted, and that curriculum does not meet the needs of gifted kids, even when it says it does. Now, I'm not going to name it right now. I do have a son who's an attorney, but I don't think he would be very happy if the first time that I needed his lawyer services were when I got sued by a big curriculum company. But there is a big curriculum company who I have called out on the website formerly known as Twitter, who has this basically like scripted curriculum. And they say that it is designed to meet the needs of high ability kids. But when I asked them, I filled out multiple times, I filled out contact forms on their website, telling them, explaining who I was, telling them I wanted to talk with them about how their curriculum actually did work with gifted kids. I DM'd them on Twitter. I found the person on LinkedIn a message. I think I probably sent 7 or 8 messages and they never responded. And trust me, they know I was trying to reach them. And what does that tell us? They knew they didn't meet the needs of gifted kids, right? Those scripted lesson plans do not. And so the difficulty we come into is if you're already handed something, it's very hard then to say that you should start with your highest level learner in mind, because what you've been given does not do that. So what do? You have to ask a slightly different question if you have a scripted curriculum. The first question, you have to ask 2 questions really. The first question that you have to ask is, have my high ability students already mastered this? And so if you have a scripted curriculum, pre-assessment is going to be essential. You're going to have to be doing pre-assessment more often than you would be if you were able to be developing your lesson plans yourself. You're going to have to pre-assess because you're going to find that they will have mastered it, or at least mastered some of it, and you're going to have to provide deeper instruction. So compacted instruction where you've freed up instructional time because they've already mastered part of what they're supposed to be learning. And you have to fill that time with something. And you can do that in a few ways. You can go deeper into what they're already doing. And you can also, which Annie McNair is really good at that, at training in the specifics of going deeper into a thing. But the other thing that you can do is have students do a completely different thing of their own choosing, because there's no state in the United States, at least, that requires that students master already mastered content. If a student has already mastered the standard, they're not required to relearn the standard. There are no 3rd grade teachers who are required to go reteach single-digit arithmetic to students who have already mastered it, who learned it in kindergarten or 1st grade. They're not required to reteach it in 3rd grade. In the same way, if a 3rd grader has mastered double-digit multiplication, right, they are not going to need single-digit multiplication. And so you can give them something else. And it doesn't have to be complicated. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm like shilling my course, but I have a whole course on this because there are skills in it, right? The second thing I would say beyond that you also need, if you have a scripted curriculum, is that you have to look at it and say, instead of what can my best kids do with this, you would say, how could my best kids make the most of this? How could they make the most of this? And it will almost always be an adjustment of questioning. It will almost always be an adjustment of questioning. The questions in scripted curriculum all read to me, not all, I shouldn't say all, but many of the questions in scripted curriculum read to me like they were created by generative AI, that they're a little bit shallow, a little bit off. They sound somewhat robotic. They're not necessarily designed to lead to actual discussion in the classroom. They feel a little hollow. They feel a little pale. They feel a little like they're attempting to be high-level thinking questions. They use a lot of the edu-speak, but when you actually think about what's going to happen with the question, you end up with not a great quality question. So I would say if you have a scripted curriculum, you're going to have to pre-assess, and you're going to have to adjust the questioning for your high ability kids. All right, so let's go back to that original question again. When you have teachers who, let me say it again, in case you've joined us since I said the question was, I'm an instructional specialist. My teachers are struggling with how to balance all of the accommodations within a lesson plan. They are not looking or have time to make a completely separate lesson plan for a gifted student. So the question itself is sharing a misperception that a lot of teachers have. And I'm not saying that this instructional specialist has that misperception, but the teachers definitely do. In this, the teacher she's talking about. Their misperception is that if I meet the needs of gifted kids, they have to be doing something completely different from what everyone else is doing. That if I'm truly meeting the needs of my gifted kids, then anybody walking in the room should be able to tell, oh, those kids over there are the ones who are gifted because see, everybody else is doing a worksheet and they are building a terrarium or, whatever, insert cool project here. And the problem with that is too much of a focus on what gifted kids are doing rather than what gifted kids are thinking. You can adjust the thinking of any activity that students are doing simply by changing the thinking level of it, right? What are they doing with it? You could also adjust what they're required to produce as a result of the learning. So I would say, and of course, there are other things you can differentiate as well. You can differentiate the environment and you can differentiate the content itself. But if you can just adjust the process by which they are learning and or the way in which they are demonstrating that learning, which is called the product, then if you do that, you're halfway to some pretty solid differentiated practice. So this week I put out on Tuesday in my I'm gonna put it in, well, I don't even know where it shows up. I'm gonna try to put it in the chat. Although I don't know when I post stuff, I don't know if it goes to, looks like it goes to both Facebook and YouTube, but I just put a link to an article I have on making choice menus better. And then I'm going to put another article link to where I have a freebie that is differentiation. It's a differentiation freebie that lets you create a menu. It's like a template for a menu. Hopefully it looks like it posted on YouTube, but not Facebook. So it'll be there. In any event, if you just Google Gifted Guru shape, it will take you to the freebie. So yeah, it looks like it's not posting to Facebook, but it is. Well, it eventually posted to Facebook, it looks like. Anyway, I see the chat over to the right, but it's a little bit different because I'm streaming simultaneously to both YouTube and Facebook. So in this choice menu template that I have, and I have included several sample choice menus, just offering choice is a good place to start. Now, in the article, Making Choice Menus Better, I explain that differentiation using a menu is almost always differentiation by interest, not ability, but it's a place to start. And you can use menus to differentiate by ability, but it's just most commonly not done that way. So the next thing I would say to this instructional specialist is, after the teachers have started planning for their high level learners first, and after they've started, if they have a scripted curriculum, if they've confronted it to say, how could my gifted learners get even more out of this, right? Like, imagine that you bought a rotisserie chicken at Costco or Sam's, and you just like cut a bunch of the meat off of it and made chicken salad sandwiches, but then you just toss the carcass, as opposed to you like get all the meat off of it and then you boil it down and you make a broth, and then you let it sit for days in a crock pot and you make a bone broth out of it. Like, that is really sucking the marrow out of it, right? And we can do that same thing with lessons. Like, what could we do with this small thing to make it better? And then they could maybe throw in some menus as an easy way, just a little differentiation by choice. In the last office hours, I talked about differentiation. And then I also made another, I wrote an entire article. I'd done an Instagram reel on differentiation and like 12 quick things, 12 quick ideas for differentiation. And I then made a blog post article about that. I'll post it in the chat. Not sure where it's going to show up, but it is the latest post on the blog. It's like 12 quick differentiation ideas. So, and it looks like it posted in both places there. So the next thing I would say is look at that list. What is something that they can do? A differentiated classroom, I think a lot of people see it as either or. Either it is this like full on like professional level differentiated circus where every kid is doing something different. It's like whack-a-mole, everything going on all differently. When in actuality, I would say you can get some pretty effective differentiation without going that far, right? Like, differentiation doesn't have to be this enormous process for you. There are small things you can do to make the kids' lives a little better. I'm currently updating a presentation I have on curiosity. And I was rereading a research article that was published in 1960 by a researcher on curiosity and the connection between curiosity and learning. And one of the things that the researcher said is, well, what his research revealed essentially or demonstrated is that if kids have no curiosity about what they're learning, then they're less likely to learn it. And that doesn't seem like you needed a research study to prove, does it? Like, doesn't that seem kind of obvious? And yet, we expect gifted kids to be fully engaged in the work that they have no curiosity over because they have already mastered it. So this is the problem. If we do not have anything that needs to be known, what in the literature on curiosity they call the gap, if there's no gap between what they already know and what we're expecting them to learn, there's no gap there, then there can be no curiosity. And in this particular researcher's work, he talks about curiosity as being both a state of being, right? Where you're, oh, I'm curious about how this happened, right? And then it is also a personality trait. So you have people who are just naturally more curious, but then you also can take people who aren't naturally curious and their curiosity can be aroused. You also can have people who are naturally curious, but you can drive their curiosity right out of them. And so and that happens in school every day with gifted kids, every single day. And so I think that one of the things that we have to consider when we're working with teachers who have gifted students in their class is, number one, start with your highest level learner in mind. Number two, dip your toe cautiously into the differentiation pool. Like, you don't have to drown. Just take little baby steps in and get up, just go forward, I think then making sure that you are not drowning out the curiosity by not having any gap between what they know and what you're teaching. And you discover that gap through pre-assessment. The last thing I'm going to say about this question before I move on to the next one, which is about depth and complexity, is that some of this is a mindset shift. And I said this in the last live stream, that there are two things required for a differentiated practice on a teacher's part. One is skill, but the other is desire. They have to actually want to. And if the teacher, him or herself, is not gifted, doesn't have any gifted kids, doesn't have any friends who are gifted, they may not see how important it is. And it's up to us to help them see the plight of the gifted kid who is coming to school languishing. Like, it's almost like when I've seen beached whales where they're just, they need to be back in the water, right? And you and friendly people on the shore can pour water over them, but that's not where they need to be. And that is a lot of what the gifted experience is. I have never thought of this analogy before, so maybe it falls apart in a second, but really I think that it probably holds up, that gifted kids put in a regular classroom with no differentiation are a lot like a fish out of water or a whale out of water, which is not a fish because it's a mammal, but where they really can't breathe. It's not their natural habitat. They aren't designed to be there. And that if we can recognize that, if we can recognize that plight, if we can recognize the distress, then it becomes easier to be willing to meet that need. Now, I'll end this by just saying that I can differentiate a lesson plan. I can make a lesson plan that meets the needs of multiple levels of my students in a way that takes about 5 minutes more than if I just was trying to meet the needs of a homogenous group. And I think it's a bold move to say that your kids aren't worth 5 minutes. I think that's bold. Now, is everybody going to be able to do that as they start? No, they're not. They're not, right? I've been working on establishing a differentiated practice in my classroom since I started college in 1984. And so it takes time, right? It doesn't take 41 years, but it does take time. And you're gonna struggle with it at first. But if you're committed to it, if you recognize the plight and you're willing to spend 5 minutes, you could come up with something pretty decent just in 5 minutes. So maybe if you just said to yourself, I'm going to give these kids 5 minutes at the beginning of my planning, not at the end, at the beginning of my planning, I'm going to give these kids 5 minutes of thought and see what I could come up with. I think the whole world would be a better place, to be honest. All right. Next question. The next question is a really complicated one. Okay. This next question has to do with depth and complexity, the thinking prompt of big idea. So I got this question and it says, a couple of years ago, I was tasked with coming up with a plan to increase our test scores. And I decided to introduce depth and complexity to my staff, and they really loved it. Our tech person and I conducted a year-long PD. We've hit a few roadblocks, but it's doing well. My question for you is how to explain big idea versus main idea. Okay, now, friends, I got so confused by this that I've read it over and over like 15 times. So don't feel bad if I'm reading this and you're thinking, I do not understand what's going on here. I was with you. Okay, so here we go. How do you explain big idea versus main idea? I tried to explain that big idea could be the theme that I can change depending on how kids interpret. For example, the information in a story. I don't understand what that is. I don't understand. That doesn't make any sense to me. I read that sentence over and over. I don't get it. I don't understand. And she says, however, my 5th grade team struggles with this especially. And I was like, I'm with your 5th grade team. I don't know what you're saying. I wrote her back and I said, well, the theme or main idea is big idea, but that's not the only possible big idea you could have when discussing literature. You could have like, what's the big idea of why the character acted the way that he or she did, for example, right? Like at the end of a story, what's the big idea of why Mr. Tumnus behaved the way that he did in the Chronicles of Narnia or something, right? Like that can have its own big idea. Big idea is not only theme or main idea. And usually we will use the term theme when talking about fiction and main idea when talking about nonfiction, but that's not written in the rules anywhere. And this particular question gets more crazy. She wrote me back and said, when I first introduced depth and complexity, the teachers were worried that using big idea and main idea interchangeably would confuse students. So I reached out to my supervisor for more clarification, and I was told they are actually two different things and to present it to my staff in this way. And she included an image. And I don't actually know. Can I do this? Okay. I've never tried to do this before, but I'm going to try to pull up this image. Okay. I have, there it is. Oh my goodness, I did it. Okay. I feel like I just won a prize. Okay. So this is the slide she sent me. Big idea versus main idea. So big idea being the depth and complexity, big idea. The depth and complexity, thinking prompt of big idea. Main idea, central idea of the story. So she also said that in her state standards, main idea or theme is also called central idea, which actually I feel like central idea is actually a better term because you could use that for both fiction and nonfiction, but whatever. I don't care what they call it. It doesn't really matter. Central idea of the story, the message the author wants to portray, usually found in the story, and it doesn't change. Big idea. Similar to a book club discussion, people interpret the same story or part differently. No, that's not accurate. That's not true. Big idea is abstract. It can be implied. I don't know what they mean by that. I literally do not know what they mean by that. Students can have different big ideas. Must be supported with details. Well, the big idea has to be supported by something. It doesn't have to be details. It often is details. That's why I use the leaf emoji for details. And the thing I didn't even realize I had my phone on. I've been waiting for my daughter-in-law to call me back for like 3 days, and she just called me back when I'm doing this, but that's okay. So I use the leaf emoji for details, and then the tree emoji for big idea, like all these leaves together make a tree. But you can also support big idea with other thinking prompts. You can support it with patterns. You can support it with language of the discipline. You can support it with any of the other thinking prompts can support a big idea. So I want to take this diagram apart because it's completely wrong. First of all, main idea, yeah, that's the central idea of the story, but it is also a big idea. So big idea and main idea are not competitors. Big idea is the thinking prompt that we use to discuss main idea. So in the same way that patterns is the thinking prompt that we use to discuss anything that is a cycle, anything that repeats, right? So life cycle of the plant, life cycle of the butterfly, all of that is pattern. And pattern is the thinking prompt that we use to discuss cycle. Big idea is the thinking prompt that we use to discuss main idea. I think the confusion is coming because the word idea is in both of them, and maybe that sounds redundant. But this diagram, this slide, I have written a book on depth and complexity. Like I would put my knowledge of depth and complexity up against anyone's, right? And I looked at this and thought, I don't even understand what's going on here. It's like Greek to me. I don't understand what's going on. The message the author wants to portray is author's purpose. Author's purpose could be discussed using big idea, for sure. But author's purpose could also be discussed with the thinking prompt of trend, because trends is not just a direction something is headed, but what are the forces acting on that are making it go that direction. So let's say the author's purpose, like for instance, when Jonathan Swift wrote his short story, A Modest Proposal. Well, it wasn't a short story. He wrote this essay, A Modest Proposal, and it was satire on the Irish potato famine. And the solution was, oh, we'll eat the Irish children, right? His author's purpose was to stand up against the racism, essentially, against the Irish, and to confront the horror of the Irish potato famine. So you could discuss it with trend, like what's going on that's influencing that. But yes, author's purpose could be discussed with big idea, usually found in the story. I don't know what that means. As opposed to what? Like, as opposed to found at the grocery store, or usually found in the story, meaning that you usually can tell, like when you read the story, you usually can tell. I would argue, and I'll say this in case you've never heard me or met me before and just randomly the algorithm fed this live stream to you. I have a master's degree in English education. I have an MEDT, a master's of education in teaching with English as my content area. So I have a master's degree in English. I have an undergraduate degree in English. I have spent a bulk of my teaching career teaching language arts. I have yet to encounter a story or an article published. Like, I'm not saying I haven't read one that my kids have created, but I have yet to meet a published story or article or novel that did not have some kind of main idea, central idea, or theme. Otherwise, what's the point of writing it? There has to be a takeaway. The main idea is going to be that takeaway. So yes, now it isn't necessarily found in the story in the sense of I've also not seen an author saying, like, oh, by the way, the theme of this story is blank, right? And many stories will have multiple themes. I mean, think about in Steinbeck's East of Eden, we could probably come up with 12 solid themes. All of them would be a big idea. And then the idea that the main idea doesn't change. I'm also going to disagree with that, because you're not going to have, you aren't necessarily going to have just one. And the way that people interpret it can be different over time. So example would be a story like Anna Karenina, where when it was published, the themes of it would be seen from the perspective, and even like Russians would get a different theme or a main idea out of it than an American reading it today. So I don't necessarily agree that the main idea doesn't change. The other thing, now let's go over to big idea. Similar to book club discussion, people interpret the same story part differently. I don't understand this book club discussion thing, but can kids have a different takeaway on a big idea? Yes, but it should be defensible, right? So like if I'm reading The Cat in the Hat and I read it, and as a mom, I say, well, the theme of this is that you should definitely follow the rules that your parents give to you because they're there for a reason. Whereas a little kid reading it could say, the big idea of this story is that if you don't do what your mom says, lots of really fun things happen. And in this case, that would be a big idea supported by the rules thinking prompt, not details. So there's a good example of how it's not always supported by details. So yes, we could interpret it differently, but the same thing is true of main idea. So that is not, this isn't a dichotomy. Big idea is abstract. It can be implied. I would argue that the main idea is almost always implied. To the extent that a lot of times in a nonfiction piece, you're going to have a like a thesis statement. At some point, they're going to share their thesis and support it, at least hopefully. And so it's not abstract then. So it's more likely to be abstract in fiction than in nonfiction. But the idea that that's because it's a big idea, as opposed to that it's fiction, not nonfiction, is false. Students can have different big ideas. Yes, that's true, but they can also have different main ideas, right? And it must be supported by details. As I said, everything has to be supported by something, whether you support it with, like, any big idea has to be supported by something, whether you support it with details or something else is fine. Okay, so I'm going to take this away and go back. If you want it back, put a link in or put a comment and that you want to see it again. I'm so proud of myself that I was able to show it. So here's what I think is going on here. They're overthinking. They're overthinking it. They're trying to make a distinction that does not exist. This distinction does not exist. They're trying to distinguish they're trying to distinguish a big idea from a main idea so kids don't get confused by that or by the idea of the central idea, when in fact the opposite is what's really going on here. What's really going on here is that we use big idea to discuss central idea. We use big idea to discuss main idea. We use big idea to discuss theme. The big idea is the thinking prompt we use. Now remember, big idea is not the topic. The big idea is, now that we've learned all of this, so now that we've read this story, what can we say that we couldn't say before? What do we know now that we didn't know before? What is the takeaway, right? Like, how could someone's life be better because they read this story? What's the message of the story, right? Distilled down into a single sentence. Big idea is the culmination of the learning. I learned all of this about this character, or I learned all of this about this thing. Now, I'm using language arts because that was the person's question topic, but the same thing is true in science, in social studies, right? Now, one of the problems going on here is that all too often, and Ian Bird, who's my co-author on the book on depth and complexity, we've had this discussion many times, and we wrote about it in the book, in the chapter on big idea, that all too often people stay too shallow with big idea. They want to say, what is the big idea? They just want to identify it and let it go, rather than working with big idea. So when you work with big idea, and you say something like, how is the big idea of this story similar to or different from the big idea in another story? Now, you can use, that's a better question. Let me finish my thought. And let me say something here. You can use the emoji or icon for big idea without using the word big idea or the phrase big idea. So what I mean, and that might help avoid confusion, because you could say, how is the main idea of this article similar to the main idea of this article? And rather than saying big idea, you could put, how is the main idea, and then put, for me, the tree emoji for big idea next to the phrase main idea. So you can let the images do heavy lifting for you to avoid confusion, so that you're not saying both big idea, central idea, main idea all the same, and you don't get like word soup. So you could also say something like, what are 3 specific things that happen in this story that led you to believe that this is a quality big idea about the story, right? Or a quality main idea or quality central idea. And again, you can use the emoji. I think that the trouble is partly coming, in addition to the chaotic mess that is trying to distinguish main idea from big idea in a distinction that doesn't exist, is that that the question being asked is too shallow. The question should not be that shallow. The question should be a stronger question, and when the question is stronger, then there won't be as much confusion. So big idea is what we use to discuss main idea, theme, central idea, whatever you want to call it. That is what we use. They are not distinguished from each other. They are not different. That is what you use. And there are a few thinking prompts where you're always going to use that thinking prompt to discuss that thing, right? If you're doing a scientific experiment, you're always going to use rules. You're always going to use rules because lab safety is rules. The scientific method is rules. In mathematics, you're always going to use patterns and rules. Like, there are certain thinking prompts that adhere to certain content areas. And in language arts, big idea adheres to main idea, theme, central idea, whatever you want to call it. It is not different from them. It is not distinguished from them. It is what we use to analyze them. So that I do want to show you one other thing, because I can see it behind me. I want to show you what my friend gave me for my birthday. She had this made for me. So there is me. It says Mrs. Van Gammer, and then on the broom it says Gifted Guru. And then there I am with my Ravenclaw. I do wear glasses. I only need them to see far, but I'm wearing my Ravenclaw scarf. So shout out to my teacher friend, Becky Archer. We taught together, and we haven't taught together in 15 years, but we still are the best of friends. And we walk every Sunday morning at 6:30. We take like a 4-mile walk together, and she gave me that for my birthday. So I had to just give her a public shout out, because that's awesome. I'm super excited about it. I hope that both of these answers have been helpful. And I want to remind you that if you have any questions, you can always either ask them in the chat, which hopefully I would see, or you can shoot me an email. And if you want to know when office hours are happening, just make sure that you're subscribed to the email list. I'll always give a heads up that we're doing office hours, and they're always recorded. So they'll be on the YouTube channel. You can go watch them, and there's a whole playlist of them, and you can see them. So hopefully this discussion of differentiation again, and of big idea, main idea kind of thing, was helpful as well. If there are any questions about it, feel free to either throw them in the chat or shoot me an email, and I'll be back next month to do them again. Probably again early in the month, just because of December. So thank you guys so much for joining me tonight. I also just really appreciate that not very many people watch the live streams. They'll get hundreds of views later, mostly on Facebook, but they hardly ever get like any likes or engagement. And I have like 7 hearts and likes, and I know it's probably a silly metric, but I just, it really makes me feel good, and I really appreciate it. So thank you very much for joining me, and I hope that you have a wonderful Friday tomorrow, and I hope that some of this discussion has been helpful to you. I will see you next time.